Everybody, welcome. I hope you had a wonderful week and that you're enjoying Plotly and Dash so far. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a web application that is connected to a live database. So we're actually going to use this code to create this web application together. And what's cool about this application is that it is connected directly to the Mongo database that we have built right here. And is also connected between the data table and the graphs. So if I change this, for example, the quantity from 15 to 98, you'll see that the pie chart and the histogram change accordingly. If I change this from alcohol to, let's say, I don't know, theater, then you'll see that this bar chart changes accordingly. Let's change this back to alcohol. Like that. And not only do the graphs change, but also the Mongo database changes right here. That's why it's live. So if I change this, for example, this you'll see here, JSON is as quantity 35. This is the first row. JSON, actually I already changed this, so let me change this to, let me refresh. You'll see here that JSON is at 45 in the first row, but if we change the first row from 45 to, let's say, 28, the graphs change, and also if you refresh your Mongo database, this is changed to 28 as well. So this is really cool because everything is live and happening at the same time. Please, if you're building this, keep it to yourself or maybe share this with one other colleague, because a web app that is updated live and updates the database live obviously should not be shared with many people, because if many people go on this at the same time, they're changing the data table at the same time, it might cause some conflict, right? So you just want to do this for yourself, or share it maybe with your own colleague for your small business or for your company or for your school or whatever. Okay, so first thing you want to do, I highly recommend you go into my GitHub right here. The link is going to be under the code. Don't forget to start and fork it so you can get some updates whenever, alerts whenever I update this. And then go into Dash and Database MongoDB. Then go into Live Mongo Dash and just copy this code and just paste it into your Python IDE like Spider, PyCharm. I'm using here on PyCharm, and this is all in here. Right? So now that you have it in here, now we can go back to the app, and now we can start our app. All right, let's do this together. There's a lot of lines of code, but don't worry. I'm going to explain every line of code, and everything is going to be clear to you, because my goal is for you. My goal is that at the end of this tutorial, you'll be able to create your own Mongo database that's tied to your own app and can be updated live. The first thing I put here is Mongo Setup Guide. So if you click on this, you'll see that it will open this guide up, and this guide is some images that I pasted for you, and some text and instructions on how to create your own Mongo database. This I created is the X industry database. It has a production table or collection. We have some users here. And this how to create a Mongo database, I'm not going to go over right now because it's a whole tutorial in itself, and there's plenty of tutorials on YouTube that show you how to create a Mongo database to set it up. So use this guide if you would like to set it up. In this case, you don't have to set up your Mongo database, because we are going to connect to my database that is already set up. So let's finish the tutorial, follow along, and then you can ask me any questions you have under the video on YouTube. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is we're importing all the libraries here. If you don't have Dash, make sure to install pip install Dash, pip install pandas, and you have to pip install pymongo srv, I think because I'm using srv here. So just do it exactly, just copy paste this into your terminal to pip install it. Okay, so now that you have all your libraries that you need, you're going to connect to your database. Now this string here, you might be asking, where did you get this string? This string is actually given to you in the setup of your database, and it's actually, if you use this guide when you set up the database, I think on page 6 you will see copy application string, and it shows you where the string is. It's right here, right? And so you just copy the string, and all you have to change is the username and the password, right? And in this case, the username is Adam3, and the password is actually my password. Very creative password name. You can see here, if you go to database access, Adam3, and if you edit, you'll be able to go into the password. Okay, so we established a connection to our Mongo database, but let's make sure that it works. You can unhashtag this. We're going to do client test. We're going to print out the database that we connected to, and then we're going to exit the script so it doesn't have to run the whole script. If you do that, you'll see that we got something here. It didn't throw an error. It showed us that there is a database. Here's a host string and some other information here, and then it says here connected true. So we know that it works. Good. So we're connected to our database. We're going to hashtag this back out, and then we're going to go into the database that we created. The database that we created is X industry. If you go here, is X industry, you see, and we're going to connect to this one. So it's client, because we established this as client as our object, client X industry, and then we're going to connect to our collection. MongoDB vocabulary is collection. Collection is equivalent to table. All right. So our table or our collection is production, because you can see that here. This is the production one right here. This is all the documents or the rows inside our production collection or table. Okay. So now that we have a complete connection to our collection, to our data table, now we can actually start our app. I put this here just in case you want to use this. You can unhash all this right here, row 23 to 35, and you'll see that this is one of the ways to create a document. A document in MongoDB vocabulary means row. So to create a new row, this is a way to do it, and then you insert this row into the collection like this. All right. So this is just so you can see how to do it, but this is manually. In this web app, we're not going to do it manually. We're going to insert into the new information into Mongo database based on the user interaction, based on whatever the user changes. Okay. So I'm going to hashtag this out, and I'm going to go back in here. All right. And now we have to define the layout of our app. So we're going to all of this right here. So we're going to start our app like this, and then we're going to go into our layout. And in our layout, we're going to have, let's make this smaller. Let's run this. Make this smaller so you can see. Okay. In the layout, you'll see that we have an HTML H1. This is just the title. And then we have an interval component and a div, an empty div. Now, this is what's going to trigger one of the callbacks below in order to take the data from Mongo and put it inside a data table inside this div. So don't worry about it. This all seems, fairly like, what is he saying? I'm going to explain all of this below. This is an interval. This is an empty div. And this is another div, that's another row. And inside here we have two divs. Divs is just an empty space. And inside here we're going to have, this is going to, inside we're going to put here in the children, we're going to put a pie graph. And in this div we're going to put a histogram. Okay? There's nothing there yet. And then we have our DCC store. This is our store component where we're going to store the data that's changed. This is how we're going to know if the data, what cell data was changed, and then put this data into our Mongo database. Update the Mongo database according to that new data. All right. Now this is just the layout. There's nothing here. You can see that if I hashtag all of this out, you'll see that these are only divs. So there is nothing. If I refresh the app, the only thing we see is a title. There's nothing underneath. These are just an interval and an empty div. We're going to use the callbacks below to connect all the information into our web page. Hashtag this back in, and let's see how we do that. Run it. Okay, refresh. Okay, so Let's start with our first callback. Our first callback is going to display data table with data from Mongo database. So here what we're doing is we're going to use the first input to trigger our callback. And this input is going to be the n intervals of the interval DB. Interval DB, if you remember, is our dash core component interval component. So at the first time this is 0. Whenever I refresh the app or first load the app, this is going to be 0, and this is going to be 0, like this, and then this is going to be 0, which means this function is triggered. So it's every time I refresh the app, this function is triggered. And every time this function is triggered, we do something here, and we return a dash data table. And a data table is every time we return an object, this data table is returned into the component property of the output, right? This is how a callback works. So we're going to return this data table. All of this is being returned into the children of the Mongo data table right here. So this data table is going to be returned here, right? And that's why we see it right under the under the title. The data table is right here. All right. So how are we building this data table? As soon as we refresh the app or first load the app, this gets triggered, and then we're saying connect to our collection in MongoDB. Remember, collection is right here. We connect it to our collection production. Connect to our collection, find all the rows and data, put this inside a list, and then put this inside, convert this to a pandas data frame. And now that we have a pandas data frame, we're going to change the ID into a string. And why do we do that? Because if we go here, you'll see that the ID, if we try and edit, everything here is a string, but the ID that's automatically generated is an object ID. And an object ID cannot be read into a dash data table. So we're going to change this. We're going to convert this into a string. This whole column right here, all of this is going to be a string instead of an object. And now that it's a string, now we can put it inside our data table. So dash data table dot data table. ID is going to be our data table, so we can refer to it in the callbacks below. This is all our data. This is all of our rows. We're using the df, remember, the df that we just created from Mongo. And the columns, this is a list comprehension. Bit weird to understand, but we're saying for P and df, so for every column inside the df, ID, employee, quantity, and so on, for every column inside here, if the column name equals underscore ID equals this, then create this column ID name and just make it editable false. So the user cannot edit this ID. We don't want the user to edit this column because obviously this is an automated generated ID. But if it's not equal ID, if it's something else, then just create another column. Every dictionary is a column, and editable true. So then we can change this from Jason to Tommy or whatever, right? So this is editable true. So everything here is editable. All the other columns are editable. All right, so now that we have our data table that goes into the children of our div, that goes in right here. Now we are going to we're going to use the client-side callback, which is written in JavaScript, but don't worry, you don't have to understand this. I'm not going to even explain this, just copy this. We're going to use this client-side callback to store the row ID and column ID of the cell that was updated. So we need to know when a user updates a cell, we need to know what cell was updated. Was this on row 2? Was this on row 3? Was this on column quantity, on column part? We need to know exactly where it was in the data table. So this is what this app client-side callback does. So you can just copy paste this. And what it's doing is, briefly, we're taking the state of our, we're taking the data previous property of our table. Remember, our table is the ID of our data table. So we're going to go into the data previous property. Data previous is just another property that if you go into the Dash DataTable and you do Control F, data previous, you'll see that this is another property, and you can read all about it, right? So we'll go into the data previous, and we'll extract the data previous. We'll also extract the data of our data table, and then all of this here, this function, what it does, it creates 2 different or 3 different arrays, and it compares between the new data and the old data. And if it's different, if the old data and the new data are different, then it will create a list of 2 strings. The first string is a row ID, and the second string is a column ID. And we'll see that in a sec. We'll see exactly how it looks like in 2 seconds. All right. What I forgot to mention is that this list, well, actually you can see it here. If I change this from 28, let's change 18. 18 to 15. You'll see that this is row number 1, because this is 0, and this is row number 1, and this is column quantity. So you can see here, if you go all the way down, row number 1 and column quantity. So this list of 2 strings is actually this change ref. And this change ref is stored into the data property of our change cell. And the change cell, if you go to the ID, is right here, right? So this goes into our data property. This goes in here. It goes change whatever, however that was called, ref, okay? Great. So now that we store the data, that list of where the cell that was changed, into our client browser, now we can use this again to access it, and then to update our Mongo database with our last callback. So let's see how we do that here. Remember, again, what we're doing is we're going to access this information, the data where the cell was changed, in order to tell Mongo database exactly what was changed and how it was changed, what data was changed. So let's see how we do this here. This is the last callback. We're going to update the Mongo data table, and we're going to create the graphs. So the 2 inputs that are going to trigger the callback function are data of the data table. This is the most up-to-date data of the whole data table, all of this, right? A list of all the dictionaries and all the different rows. And then we're going to also take the data of the change cell, the data of the DCC store, which is that string, right here, that list of 2 strings. All right. So whenever the data, the changed store data is changed, or the data table is changed, this is activated, and we're going to say, if CC is none, then build these graphs. And why if CC is none? Because when we first load the app, whoops, this is not the app. When we first load the app, there is no change data. We didn't change anything yet, right? We just loaded the app. So that means that the CC, which is this stored data right here, it's going to be empty. It's going to be null. It's going to be none, because there is no change data. So if there's no change data, I still want to build 2 graphs, and I'm going to build the pie chart and the histogram using the table data right here, which is the same as all of this. All this table data. So we're going to use the table data to build the pie chart and the histogram, right? Because I just want to build this based on all the data that I have in the data table. So now we have that. But else, if CC has been changed, if there is something inside our store data, because CC has been changed from 28 to 20, then what we're going to do is we're going to print the change cell. We just want to look at it right here, and we're going to print the current data table right here. These are the 2 things we're printing. So let's see, this is 0 in quantity. Let's change let's change the 3rd row or 2nd row, because it's 0, 1, 2. Let's change it to 15. And now you'll see that because CC is not none, we're going to print this, and this equals to row 2 right? And quantity column, because this is row 2 and this is the quantity column. Okay, and it's also going to print the data table, which is a list of all the different dictionaries, and every dictionary is a row inside the data table. All right, now let's see how we take this information to actually update our Mongo database. We're going to take a small commercial break here. If you're enjoying this tutorial, don't forget to like this video, subscribe below, and if you want to support me on Patreon or on YouTube, I thank you. This is a completely member-supported channel, and the education that I provide and the content I provide is completely supported by you. So, cool. All right. So let's see how we do this here. We're going to create a few objects here: row ID, column ID, in order to update the Mongo database. And how do we do that? First, we're saying, look, we're saying, let's do a new example. Let's change the first one from 20 to 13. All right. So we printed this out. We have the change cell is the string 0, and because it's row 0, and quantity column, right? Which is correct. This cell right here. Now we're going to change this CC0, the first item in this list. We're going to change this into an integer because this is a string. So we want to make it an integer for now. And then we're going to create an object called row ID. And this is going to be our data table X, which in this case is 0, right? 0. Oops, not that. 0 right here in this case. And then ID column. So this row ID is going to be equal to data table 0, this row, with the ID column. So this data table ID is actually going to be equal to this right here. Like that. A string like that. Right? Because it's the first row in under the ID column. And then, let me just put this here actually so it's easier for you to remember. This is a string, right? Now the column ID is just going to be the second item inside the list. This is 1. This is going to be quantity. The string, in this case, is quantity. Okay, so we have quantity, and then the new cell data is actually going to be the data that has been changed. So we'll access that new data because it's data table 0, column ID quantity. So this leads us to data table 0, column ID quantity 13. So this here is going to be equal to 13, right? So now that we have, and this is for the first row. If I change a different row, obviously this data will be different right here. Okay? And now that we have the necessary information, now we can update our Mongo database. So I'm using an operation called update 1. There are many different operations with a Mongo database that you can do. Click on this right here, this link. This link will lead you to this right here, to all the different operations, the CRUD operations, right? And we're going to look into update operations. And in here, we're going to look into update 1. And in here, it explains what update 1 is and how to use it, right? With all the properties and parameters, blah, 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 blah. And then if you go down a little bit, I'm going to use this example. There's some examples here below, right here. Here's the first example. The following operation updates a single document named Central Park Cafe with the violations field. So I just copy pasted this right here in order to into my code. So what I did is like this is collection dot update 1. Remember our collection is way up here. We already connected to it, to our production collection. Collection update 1. Open this function, and then the first dictionary is going to be the row where we want to update the information, and the row is going to be the ID equals object ID row ID. Now, why do we have to put object ID? Because remember, this ID in Mongo database is an object ID. So we imported this, remember? We imported an object ID, you can do that. And then we're just converting this string, this row ID string, we're converting it into an object ID so it can be read by Mongo database update one operation, right? So now we know what row we're going to update. We're going to update the row with this ID. And then we're going to update the column. We do set. We're going to update the column where the column ID equals quantity, right? Here it equals quantity, which is right here, quantity, right here, in this first row, in this column ID. Cancel. And in this quantity, we're going to update with the new cell data. And the new cell data was 13. So now we put here, this is like 13, right? And you can see that if we refresh this, refresh, this should be quantity 13 now instead of 28. Oops, so refresh again. 13, you see? And this is all because of this right here. All right, so these I highly recommend, because I want you to learn how to do this on your own and how to read the documentation. Use this. This is very important. The example part shows many different examples of how to update data, how to update new rows, how to insert new rows, how to delete. It's all inside here. All right, if you have any questions, you can ask me on YouTube, but this is a great tool to guide to use. Okay, so now that we updated our information on Mongo database, we have it on our database, and now we're just going to build our graphs. We're going to build our graphs from the data table itself. We don't need to use the collection because we already have the new data in our data table. So we're going to use that to build our pie figure and our histogram. And because we build this graphs, now we can put these, or figures, we can put these figures, we can assign them inside the figure property of the dcc graph. And because we have two objects in the return function, in the return callback function, now these two objects are returned to the first output property and to the second output property, right? So this is the children of the pie graph, which is right here. It's like an empty children in this one, and there's an empty children in this one where we put our histograms. All right, that's really it. I hope you learned a lot. If you like this tutorial, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe below. If you want to support me on YouTube and Patreon, I really appreciate it. If you have any questions on YouTube, don't forget to use the guides. Good luck. Enjoy the process. Take some rest if you're going out of your mind and you get stuck. And have fun. That's the most important thing. Always remember, we're better together, so help each other out. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.